The maid served their engagement party in tears. Then the billionaire stood up and changed everything. She stood at the head of the table, serving the woman who had ruined her life, and no one else in that room knew it. One more lie tonight, and she would lose her job, her home, and the only life she'd built for her daughter. But the ring on the fiancé's finger wasn't the one the billionaire had chosen, and only the maid seemed to notice. Her hands shook as she poured the wine, tears sliding down her face while 300 guests smiled and toasted. What the billionaire was about to discover before dessert was even served would end the engagement, and no one saw it coming. Welcome back to another story about the quiet moments that change everything, where kindness is tested, and the truth always finds its way to the surface. If stories about loyalty, hidden truths, and hard-won justice speak to you, you're exactly where you need to be. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments and stick around because this one is going to stay with you. The Hartwell estate glittered that night like something out of a movie. Crystal chandeliers threw gold light across 300 guests, and a string quartet played somewhere near the garden doors. Everyone had come to see Nathaniel Hartwell get engaged. Nathaniel was 36, the kind of wealthy that didn't need to announce itself. He'd built his fortune in real estate development, starting with one crumbling apartment building in Baltimore and turning it into a company that now owned half a dozen luxury towers along the East Coast. He wasn't flashy. He didn't wear his money loud. He wore it the way some men wear a good coat, comfortable, unremarkable, entirely his. Tonight he wore a charcoal suit and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Standing beside him was Vanessa Cole, effortlessly elegant in deep blue silk, her laugh carrying across the room every few minutes, timed perfectly for whoever was watching. She had been in Nathaniel's life for 18 months. She came from money herself. Old Connecticut money, the kind that had quietly funded half the charities in the tri-state area. On paper, she was exactly the woman a man like Nathaniel was supposed to marry. And weaving through the crowd with a silver tray, refilling glasses and clearing plates, was Amara Whitfield. Amara was 27. She'd worked for the Hartwell household for 2 years, ever since she'd needed steady income and reliable hours to raise her daughter Nia, who had just turned 3. Amara didn't complain about long shifts. She didn't gossip with the other staff about the family. She showed up early, stayed late when needed, and treated the job the way she treated everything, with quiet, stubborn dignity. Tonight, though, her hands weren't steady. She poured wine into Vanessa's glass and felt Vanessa's eyes flick toward her, just for a second, cold and amused, the way you'd look at something you'd already decided didn't matter. "Careful," Vanessa said sweetly, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "We wouldn't want any accidents tonight." Few people chuckled. Amara said nothing. She'd learned that nothing was usually the safest thing to say. She hadn't always been just staff to this family. 2 years ago, before Vanessa entered the picture, Nathaniel's mother, Eleanor Hartwell, had personally hired Amara, and the two had grown close in a way that surprised everyone, including Amara herself. Eleanor used to say Amara reminded her of herself at that age. Proud, careful, unwilling to take anything she hadn't earned. Eleanor had passed away 8 months ago. Amara still wore, tucked beneath her uniform collar, a small gold pendant Eleanor had given her the Christmas before she died. Nathaniel didn't know that. Vanessa did, and she hated it. "Whitfield." Vanessa's voice again, sharper now, closer. "The Andersons need their glasses topped off. That is your job, isn't it?" "Of course, Miss Cole." Amara moved without looking up. Nathaniel caught the exchange from across the room, but only a fragment of it. Vanessa smiling, Amara nodding, nothing that looked like anything. He'd noticed, over the last few months, a coolness between the two women. He'd asked Vanessa about it once. She'd laughed it off. "She's just sensitive, Nate. Staff get territorial. It's nothing." He'd believed her. Why wouldn't he? Vanessa had never given him a real reason not to. What Nathaniel didn't know was that 3 weeks earlier, Vanessa had gone to Amara privately with an offer. She wanted access to a set of old files in Eleanor's private office. Financial records, letters, things Eleanor had kept locked away before she died. Vanessa claimed they were sentimental items she wanted for Nathaniel's sake. A surprise gift. Amara, who had a spare key from her days helping Eleanor organize the office, had refused. "Those aren't mine to give," Amara had told her. "And they're not really yours to ask for, Miss Cole." Vanessa's expression had changed in that moment. Just for a second, the polished mask slipping to reveal something sharper underneath. "You'll regret that," she'd said quietly and walked away. Amara hadn't understood then how much that refusal would cost her. But something had shifted after that conversation. Small things. Her hours got harder. Tasks got assigned unfairly. Twice now, Vanessa had found mistakes in Amara's work that Amara was certain she hadn't made. A stained tablecloth, a missing piece of silverware. Small enough to seem accidental, consistent enough to seem deliberate. Tonight, as the toasts began and Nathaniel raised his glass to formally announce the engagement, Amara stood near the back wall with her tray, watching. "To Vanessa," Nathaniel said, his voice warm and sure. "The woman who's shown me what it means to build a life with someone who understands you." The room erupted in applause. Vanessa's eyes glistened with practiced emotion. And then, for one brief moment, as she lifted her hand to wipe away a tear, her engagement ring caught the light. Amara froze. She knew that ring. Not this ring, a different one. She had seen Nathaniel's private jeweler bring a ring to the estate for approval only 2 weeks earlier, a simple emerald-cut diamond in a rose gold setting, the one Nathaniel had spent nearly an hour describing to Eleanor's old assistant as exactly what she would have wanted him to choose. Elegant, not showy. The ring on Vanessa's finger tonight was not that ring. It was a larger stone, a different cut entirely in white gold. Amara told herself she was mistaken. Rings could be resized, reset, exchanged. It was possible. It was probably nothing. But something in her gut told her it wasn't nothing at all. She didn't say anything. She couldn't. Not here, not now. Not as a maid at an engagement party with 300 witnesses and a fiancé who had already promised her regret. She simply refilled the next glass and the next, and kept her eyes down, and carried the quiet weight of a question she wasn't yet allowed to ask. Across the room, Nathaniel laughed at something a guest said, unaware that the celebration he was so sure of had already begun quietly, invisibly, to crack. 3 days after the engagement party, Nathaniel found himself standing in his mother's old office for the first time in months. He hadn't planned to go in there. He'd meant to walk past it on his way to the study, but something, grief maybe or habit, pulled him toward the door instead. The room still smelled faintly of his mother's perfume, lavender and something warmer underneath. Her reading glasses still sat on the desk where she'd left them. He noticed the filing cabinet first. One drawer, usually locked, stood slightly open. Nathaniel wasn't a suspicious man by nature. He believed mostly that people were who they presented themselves to be, and he extended that belief generously to everyone in his life, including, especially, Vanessa. But standing in his mother's office, looking at a drawer that should have been locked, something small and uneasy settled in his chest. He checked the contents. Most of it was as he remembered. Old tax documents, letters, a few photographs. But a folder was missing. He remembered it specifically because his mother had shown it to him once, years ago, with a strange seriousness in her voice. A folder labeled simply, Family Trust, Contingencies. He asked the household staff if anyone had been in the office recently. Most said no. But when he asked Amara, she hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, but he caught it. "I haven't gone in there since your mother passed, Mr. Hartwell," she said. "I don't have a reason to." It was true. But it wasn't the whole truth, and Nathaniel, watching her carefully for the first time in a long while, sensed there was something she wasn't saying. "You have a key, though. My mother gave you one." I do. I haven't used it. He believed her mostly. But the question stayed with him longer than he expected. That evening, Vanessa found him still turning it over in his mind. Missing files. Nate, it's probably nothing. Your mother was. She kept things in strange places sometimes, near the end. She said it gently, sympathetically, resting a hand on his arm. Don't let it eat at you. We have a wedding to plan. It should have reassured him. Instead, something about the way she said near the end, a little too smooth, a little too quick to redirect, sat wrong with him, though he couldn't have said why. 2 days later, a new development complicated things further. Nathaniel's longtime driver, Marcus, mentioned in passing that he'd dropped Vanessa off at a private jeweler on Fifth Avenue the week before the party, the same jeweler Nathaniel had used to select her ring. Probably picking up a repair, Marcus said, shrugging, not thinking much of it. Nathaniel hadn't sent her there. He hadn't asked for any repair. And when he mentioned it to Vanessa that night, testing the waters carefully, she brushed it off with practiced ease. Oh, that. I wanted them to adjust the band slightly, it was pinching. I didn't want to bother you with it. Reasonable. Believable. And yet Nathaniel found himself, for the first time in their relationship, quietly comparing her explanations against what he already knew, checking the seams instead of accepting the whole cloth. Meanwhile, Amara's situation was worsening. Vanessa had begun finding new reasons to criticize her work in front of others, a wrinkle in a folded napkin, a slightly late breakfast tray, nothing that would normally warrant comment, all of it delivered with a smile that made it hard for anyone watching to believe anything cruel was happening at all. She's just thorough, Vanessa told the head housekeeper once, when Amara wasn't in the room. I just think we should hold our staff to a higher standard, don't you? It was manipulation dressed as reasonableness. And it was working. Amara noticed the other staff starting to treat her differently. Not unkindly exactly, but carefully, the way people treat someone they suspect might be in trouble. At home that night, Amara sat on the edge of Nia's bed after tucking her in, running through the day in her mind. She thought about the ring. She thought about Vanessa's threat weeks ago. She thought about the missing folder, and the fact that only 2 people had keys to that office. Herself, and she now remembered with a cold jolt Vanessa, who had asked Eleanor for a spare key nearly a year ago in case of emergencies, a request Eleanor had granted out of politeness more than trust. Amara hadn't thought about that key in months. She thought about it now. She had no proof of anything. No one would believe a maid's suspicions over a woman like Vanessa Cole, not without something solid to back it up. And if she said the wrong thing to the wrong person, she risked losing not just her job but her home, the modest apartment 2 blocks from Nia's daycare, the only stability she'd managed to build. But she also thought about Eleanor, who had trusted her with a key and a friendship most people in that house never got. Eleanor had told her once near the end, "If anything ever seems wrong in this house after I'm gone, Amara, don't stay quiet just because it's easier." Amara hadn't understood what she meant at the time. She was starting to. The next morning, she found something that made the question impossible to ignore any longer. A single sheet of paper, half burned in the fireplace of the guest room Vanessa used as a private study, with just enough of it left unburned to read 3 words. Trust dissolves upon. Amara stood frozen in the doorway, staring at it, understanding immediately that whatever secret was buried in that missing folder, someone had just tried very hard to make sure no one would ever read it. Amara didn't touch the burned paper. She'd learned enough from crime shows Nia liked to fall asleep to that fingerprints mattered, that evidence handled wrong stopped being evidence at all. She photographed it instead, quickly, with a disposable phone she kept for emergencies, then backed out of the room and closed the door exactly as she'd found it. For 2 days she said nothing. She turned the photograph over in her mind constantly, trying to imagine what document could contain the words "trust dissolves upon," and why someone would burn it rather than simply put it back. She thought about going to Nathaniel directly. But she also remembered clearly the conversation with Vanessa weeks earlier. The offer, the refusal, the threat. If she went to Nathaniel with an accusation and no real proof, Vanessa would simply frame it as jealousy, resentment, a disgruntled employee trying to sabotage the engagement. Amara had watched Vanessa turn far smaller things into weapons. She wasn't naive enough to think this would be different. She needed something more solid. And she needed help from someone Vanessa couldn't intimidate. She thought of Walter Briggs. Walter had been the Hartwell family's estate attorney for almost 30 years, ever since Nathaniel's father was alive. He'd handled Eleanor's will. He'd known Amara since her first week on the job, and unlike most of the people who moved through that house, he'd always treated her like a person rather than furniture. Eleanor had trusted him completely. Amara called his office and asked carefully, without giving too much away, whether he might be willing to meet her somewhere outside the estate. He agreed, curious, the following afternoon during her break. They met at a small coffee shop 3 blocks from the daycare where Nia spent her mornings. Amara showed him the photograph on her phone. Walter's expression changed the moment he read it. He asked her where she'd found it, and when she told him, his jaw tightened in a way she hadn't seen from him before. "I need to tell you something," he said slowly. "About 6 weeks before Eleanor passed, she came to my office and asked me to draft an amendment to the family trust. A contingency clause." He paused, choosing his words carefully. It stated that if Nathaniel married someone who had, prior to the marriage, attempted to access or alter the trust's private documentation without authorization, the marriage itself would trigger a full independent audit of that person's financial history before any shared assets could be legally combined. Amara stared at him. She thought someone might try that. She didn't name anyone specifically, but she was cautious near the end. She'd started noticing things. Walter hesitated. "Amara, if that document you photographed is a fragment of that clause, and someone burned the original to prevent Nathaniel from ever seeing it, that's not just family drama. That's potentially fraud, depending on what else is involved." It was the first time Amara had heard anyone else say out loud what she'd feared for weeks, that this wasn't simply about jealousy or cruelty. There was something underneath it, something with real stakes. Walter agreed to quietly begin looking into whether a copy of the original clause existed anywhere else, with a county recorder in his own old files anywhere. He asked Amara to say nothing to anyone in the meantime, including Nathaniel, until they had something concrete. If Vanessa suspected anyone was looking, she'd have time to cover her tracks further. Amara agreed, though it cost her something to keep quiet. Every day that passed, she watched Nathaniel move closer to a wedding date with a woman who may have burned evidence in his own mother's house. 4 days later, Walter called her with news. He'd found a digital copy of the original amendment, saved automatically to the firm's secure server the day Eleanor had signed it, untouched, unburned, fully intact. And what it revealed was worse than either of them expected. The clause wasn't only about unauthorized access to documents. Eleanor had specifically named a set of conditions under which the marriage could be legally contested for fraud, including if it was later discovered that the future spouse had knowingly misrepresented previous debts, legal history, or existing financial obligations prior to the engagement. Walter had also done something else. Quietly, discreetly, using resources available to a man who'd spent 3 decades handling wealthy families' private affairs, he'd run a background check on Vanessa Cole. What he found didn't match the woman Nathaniel believed he was marrying. Vanessa Cole was, in fact, her legal name. But 11 years ago, under a different surname, her mother's maiden name, Vanessa Marsh, she had been the subject of a civil fraud lawsuit in Connecticut, related to the mishandling of a family charitable trust she'd managed briefly in her early 20s. The case had been settled quietly, out of court, with a confidentiality agreement that had kept it out of the public eye for over a decade. It explained everything: her interest in the trust documents, her panic when Amara refused to hand them over, the burned paper. Vanessa hadn't wanted a sentimental keepsake. She'd been trying to find out before the wedding, Exactly what Eleanor's contingency clause said, and whether it would expose her past the moment she married into the family. Amara sat with the news for a long moment, feeling something complicated settle in her chest. Not triumph, not yet, but the quiet, steadying relief of finally understanding the shape of the thing she'd been fighting blind. "We need to tell him," she said. "Before the wedding." Walter nodded slowly, carefully, and soon. The wedding was 11 days away when Walter Briggs requested a private meeting with Nathaniel. He didn't bring Amara. He knew how this needed to look. A lawyer presenting facts, not a maid making accusations that could too easily be dismissed as personal. Amara understood this too, though it didn't make the waiting any easier. Nathaniel listened in his study as Walter laid out everything. The contingency clause his mother had quietly added to the trust, the burned fragment discovered in the guest's study, the civil fraud case from over a decade ago under Vanessa's mother's maiden name, and finally, gently, the fact that it had been Amara who first noticed something wrong and brought it to his attention. Nathaniel sat very still through most of it. He was not a man who reacted loudly to bad news. He absorbed it quietly, the way he absorbed most things, turning it over methodically before responding. "You're telling me," he said finally, "that Vanessa lied to me about her name, her past, and possibly her intentions from the very beginning." "I'm telling you what the documents show," Walter said carefully. "I'm not telling you what it means for your relationship. That's not mine to decide." Nathaniel asked to see everything himself. The digital copy of the trust clause, the burned photograph, the court records Walter had located. He read through it slowly, his expression unreadable, while Walter waited. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter than before. "Why didn't Amara come to me directly?" "Because she was afraid of exactly what would happen if she did," Walter said. "That Vanessa would twist it into something ugly before you'd even had a chance to look at the truth. She wasn't wrong to be careful, Nathaniel. She's been navigating this with far less power than either of us." That landed harder than Nathaniel expected. He thought of the last few weeks. Small things he'd noticed and let go, moments where Vanessa had redirected his attention a little too smoothly, and the quiet way Amara had continued doing her job with dignity while apparently carrying all of this alone. He didn't confront Vanessa that night. He wanted to be certain first, not reactive. He asked Walter to formally verify the court records through official channels rather than relying solely on his private search, to make sure that when this conversation happened, it happened on unshakable ground. 2 days later, the verification came back conclusive. The lawsuit was real. The settlement was real. Vanessa Marsh and Vanessa Cole were, without question, the same woman. That evening, Nathaniel asked Vanessa to join him in his mother's old office, a location he chose deliberately. She noticed the room immediately, her expression flickering before she smoothed it over. "Why are we in here? I wanted to ask you something, and I wanted to ask it somewhere honest," Nathaniel said. He set a folder on the desk between them. Copies of the trust clause, the fraud case, nothing dramatic, just facts laid flat. "Tell me the truth, Vanessa. All of it. Right now." For a long moment she said nothing. Amara, he would later learn, wasn't even in the house that evening. She'd taken Nia to a pediatrician appointment, entirely unaware the confrontation was happening without her. This wasn't about vindication for anyone. It was finally simply about the truth. Vanessa's composure cracked slowly, then all at once. She admitted she'd changed her name after the lawsuit to avoid the association following her into new social circles. She admitted she'd suspected the trust might contain language that could complicate the marriage, given her history, and that she'd asked for access to the files hoping to understand, and if necessary remove, anything that could expose her past before the wedding made it public record. She did not, at first, Admit to burning the document. I didn't destroy anything, she said. I found old paperwork in that study and it was garbage. I burned old paperwork, that's all. The paper had 3 words on it that match exactly language from my mother's amendment, Nathaniel said quietly. You can keep lying to me, Vanessa. But I already know. She stopped. And in the silence that followed, something in her expression shifted. Not remorse exactly, but the exhausted recognition of someone who had run out of angles. I was scared, she finally said. I've spent 11 years building a life where nobody knew about Connecticut. I wasn't going to let one folder undo that. So instead you decided to marry me without telling me who you actually were. I love you, Nathaniel. That part was never a lie. He didn't answer that directly. Instead, he asked the question that had been sitting heaviest in his chest since Walter's first meeting. How long have you been trying to push Amara out? Vanessa's silence was answer enough. The engagement was called off the following morning, quietly, without a public statement, without a scene. Nathaniel handled it the way he handled most difficult things, directly, without cruelty, but without hesitation either. Vanessa left the estate that afternoon, and by evening, her belongings were gone from the guest wing entirely. What Nathaniel did next, he did carefully and deliberately because he understood by then exactly how much it mattered. He asked Amara to meet him, not in the kitchen, not in a hallway between tasks, but in his mother's office, the same room where the truth had finally surfaced. Amara arrived uncertain, still in her uniform, unsure what this meeting meant for her. The last several weeks had taught her caution, even now. I owe you an apology, Nathaniel said before she could say anything. Not just for what happened with Vanessa. For not noticing sooner. For letting things get as difficult for you as they did, in my own house, without asking why. Amara didn't know what to say at first. She'd imagined many versions of how this conversation might go. Gratitude, awkwardness, even nothing at all if Vanessa had managed to spin the story before the truth came out. She hadn't imagined this. A billionaire standing in front of her, plainly taking responsibility. You didn't know, she said finally. I didn't make it easy for you to know. I was afraid of exactly what almost happened, that if I said something, I'd be the one who paid for it. You were right to be afraid, Nathaniel said quietly. That's what bothers me most. You shouldn't have had to be. He told her then what Walter had uncovered about his mother's final months. How Eleanor in her last weeks had told Walter privately that she trusted very few people completely in that house, and that Amara had been one of them. She knew something might happen after she was gone, Nathaniel said. She just didn't get to see how it would play out. He reached into the desk drawer and withdrew a small envelope. Inside was a letter, handwritten, dated 8 months earlier. One of the last things Eleanor had written before she passed, addressed to Nathaniel, sealed, and never opened until now because Walter hadn't known when the right moment would be. In it, Eleanor asked her son to look out for Amara, plainly and without embellishment. She has more integrity in her than most people I've met in rooms full of money, Nathaniel. If you ever find yourself unsure who to trust in this house, start with her. Amara had to look away for a moment, blinking hard, holding herself together the way she'd learned to over 2 long years. Nathaniel didn't rush her. When she was ready, he continued. I'd like to do more than apologize, he said. I spoke with Walter this morning. There's a position opening at the foundation my mother started. The one that manages scholarship funding for kids in the city. It needs someone who understands what it actually means to build stability from nothing. I think that's you if you want it. It wasn't charity, and Amara understood the difference immediately. It was recognition, offered plainly without strings. I have a daughter, she said carefully. I'd need hours that work around her. Then we'll build ours that work around her, Nathaniel said. That's not a favor, Amara. That's just how it should have been from the beginning. 2 weeks later, Amara started her new role, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she walked into that house not through the service entrance, but through the front door. Nia, meanwhile, had grown fond of visiting the estate's garden on weekends, chasing the koi in the pond near the terrace, utterly unaware of how close her mother had come to losing everything, only aware that her mom smiled more now, and that the tall man with the kind eyes always crouched down to her level when he said hello. As for Vanessa, the settlement from the original Connecticut case eventually became public through unrelated court records months later, and with it, quiet questions about her conduct during the Hartwell engagement. She left the East Coast entirely, starting over somewhere new, the way people sometimes do when the version of themselves they built collapses all at once. Nathaniel never spoke publicly about what happened. He didn't need to. The people who mattered already knew the truth, and for the first time in a long while, so did he. About who he could trust, and who had been standing quietly beside him with more integrity than he'd ever fully seen. Sometimes the people we overlook are the ones holding everything together. If you were in Amara's position, watching something you knew was wrong happen right in front of you, would you have stayed silent to protect yourself or spoken up despite the risk? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story moved you, let us know your thoughts below, and subscribe if you'd like more stories about truth, quiet strength, and the moments that change everything. We've got another unforgettable story waiting for you next.